conversation with Dr. Frank Thomas and myself, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and you lead out, and we'll see where we go.
Well, Bishop, first of all, we want to thank you for just this opportunity, both you and your team, to do this very, very important work. This is very important work. And as I've said to you many times, that, the analogy that we used is that, Grandmama was in the kitchen cooking. And so she'd do a pinch of this and a pinch of that and a pinch of this and a pinch of that. And you'd watch Grandmama. Mm-hmm. And you would have the opportunity to lick the bowl.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? So you were close to Grandmama, so Grandmama didn't necessarily have to write the recipe down.
Right.
Right? Because you were close and you had seen a pinch of this, a pinch of that. So I think in your preaching, sometimes people take a pinch of this and a pinch of that. Mm-hmm. And you're a master preacher. And so part of what we're trying to do is to get a recipe, because everybody's not close to you. And you're doing tremendous preaching, and you have an organized system, but it's a recipe that you use to produce the preaching, and many people take a pinch of this, a pinch of that, a pinch of this, and they don't see the recipe.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is give some sense of a recipe, because you're doing powerful and tremendous preaching, and if we don't leave a recipe for the next generation. So I'll say this, I try not to be long, is that particularly in African American preaching, so much of our genius has gone to the grave because it wasn't written down.
Right.
Or there are people who can preach and can do it, but cannot say to other people what they're doing in a coherent system or a recipe so that somebody could pick it up and make it their own, not just copy it, but really make it their own.
When you and I first started talking about this, it was very intimidating for me, because to describe what goes on between me and the text is so intimate and so hard to articulate and put into a formula that I just thought, that's going to be really hard for me to describe, but I'm going to let you worry about describing it. I'm just going to explain what it looks like to me.
Oh, that's what I was trained to do. I'm supposed to be a homiletician.
Okay.
So I said to my father, I was a pastor, and I left pastoring after 31 years of being a pastor. I said to my father, I said, Dad, I'm getting ready to be a homiletician. He said, well, what's a homiletician? I said, homileticians are people who, who teach preaching. Well, I said, why don't y'all just call it teach preaching? I said, because we have to invent big words for stuff, so we can look intelligent. So, Bishop, let me ask a few questions that I think our audience and I would like to know. I want to talk about the nature of oratory today. So, what do you believe is the nature of oratory in our world today?
One of the reasons that I broach this subject is because I think that preaching is a dying art. Mm-hmm. And not just preaching, but throughout the span of communication, I'm seeing the dumbing down of America on camera in a way that advertises ignorance as opposed to contemplative, reflective thought. Mm-hmm. It is important to me to say something that matters, and to dress it out appropriately, that it is presented in a way that is palatable for a diverse audience of people. I think one of the contributing factors is we have so much technology that we have reduced our thought down to 143 characters. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, we minimize the whole creative process, the depth to which we ought to think. And it's not just us. I mean, we have a government now that's being run by tweets. Mm-hmm. Very serious, difficult political decisions are being described in a loose, haphazard way. And it lends itself to an increasing inability to communicate effectively in a way that people can follow your lead, understand your trend of thought, and thereby be able to grow from the experience of you. Mm-hmm. And so it is my hope that as we pass the mantle to the next generation, that the mantle is not fabric, it is far more contemplative, that it is far more responsible, that we understand the power of the mic, what it does, and whoever wells it has a lot to do with the destiny of whoever listens.
So talk to me about some of your oratorical mentors.
That is interesting. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. We weren't exposed to a lot of big speakers, big-time speakers. So I think the lack of access created the depth of appreciation. So whenever I got an opportunity to hear anybody speak, whether it was a Gardner Taylor or a C.L. Franklin, I was like a sponge. Quite frankly, whether it was a Richard Pryor or some other comedian of that era, when it comes to public speaking, every orator teaches you something. You have to have timing to be a great comedian. And if you do an entire set, it actually is written out much like a sermon. And so whatever the comedian introduces in the embryonic stages of his delivery, by the time he reaches his summary, he's brought you back to a major theme in the same way that a sermon is done. And I think, too, when I look at my heroes, Dr. Quandra Wilson, who was a trailblazer in the Pentecostal church, had a great deal of influence on me. I think that Dr. King, in my early childhood, mesmerized me with the power of the mic, what could be done with it. And when you think about the water hoses and you think about the dogs turned loose and you think about the atrocities, the girls are burned up in church and all of that, and against all of that, he has no weapon. He has no army tank. He has no military, no arsenal, no strong bodyguards. All he had was a mic and turned the country around on its ear with the microphone. And those early images and experiences taught me to respect speaking and to respect the power and the influence that it wells. And out of that respect comes an approach to public speaking and an approach to interviews and an approach to preaching that is reverent, not haphazard, not done without deep contemplation as to you have a concept that is birthed in your head and is delivered out of your mouth, and how to not abort the process from its inception to its delivery, and to make sure that, to me, communication is not just great speaking, it is also creating great listening. Because if I say a lot and you don't get it, then what good is it? And so for me, I tried to use every instrument possible to communicate the abstract ideas of the text, but also the feeling that the text creates. To articulate feelings are very challenging, and at my core, I'm a storyteller. And so my mother was a storyteller. She was a school teacher. Her mother was a missionary. I grew up around people who had the ability to articulate their feelings in such a way that she never talked to us like children. No goo goo gaga, ooh boo boo, come on. She talked to us with thought, and she listened at us with thought. My mother told me, she said, when a parent listens at a child when he's talking, it teaches him that his words matter. And with great skill and great depth and great strategy, she raised us to be able to articulate our thoughts. To translate that into preaching is another dimension, because you are measured by a different barometer when it comes to preaching, through the lens of homiletical teachings and trainings, and all of that was something I encountered as I went along. I started preaching when I was 19. I knew I was called at 17. So I didn't run into this theological reflection until I was out there. And so I didn't know whether I was breaking rules or making rules. I was just doing what God gave me.
Right. Tell me about the first time that you heard Dr. King speak.
I don't think that there will ever be another orator like him. There are many imitators, but he was in a class all by himself. And what he could do with the microphone and a crowd was just, You could quote him, but it was his voice, it was his tone, it was his body language, it was the depth of thought, it was the conviction from which the words came. So we've retained the words but lost the conviction. And so the words without the conviction just become recitation. But it was the conviction that he had, the kind of conviction that only God can give you. To withstand the vicissitudes of a society who thinks differently, and to man the microphone against all kinds of pressures and be resourceful enough to change the minds of people. Paul said, pray for us, for we wrestle with unreasonable men. And so really speaking is about wrestling with unreasonable minds, bringing them to one cohesive thought. And that has to be skillfully done.
Right. So tell me about you standing there with your father listening to Dr. King.
Oh my God, my father seldom got to sit down and watch TV, and so my early memories are of my dad sitting down watching the 6 o'clock news and Dr. King is on speaking. And I don't know who I was the most mesmerized at, the speaking of the orator or the look in my father's eye. It was then that I learned what could be done with the microphone. And the fact that my father valued it. My father was my hero. The fact that my father was impressed. And I'm looking, every boy wants to impress his father. And my father was impressed. I think those early impressions taught me the respect for the art of speaking. I've never mastered it, but I love the challenge of trying. I get knocked down and jump back up and try again. Sometimes I think I'm knocked down and other people don't think that I'm knocked down, but my standards are so high for myself when it comes to speaking, and there is a place in the spirit that I need to feel when I walk away as if I have done what I was called to do. And without that feeling, I wrestle through the night, because it is not just the reaction of the crowd that is my gauge. If I don't hear that inner sense of completion, then I go home to a night of frustration.
Yeah. So what makes for good oratory as opposed to oratory that's not very good?
Synchronization to me is very important. I don't think that you ought to raise up anything in your introduction that doesn't come through to your conclusion. I think that every message should have a DNA, and that DNA code, regardless of how you describe it, should be consistent throughout the message, though different illustrations and terms are used to depict various aspects of the message. We shouldn't have a foreign DNA at the end that is different from what we started with. How did this offspring happen? And it doesn't even look like what's going on. And I see a lot of people who deliver discombobulated messages that have no synergism, and it's difficult to follow them. They might be excited about it, they might be right, it might be true, but if it's not harmonious, if it's not cohesive, if it's not strategic, then it's disoriented, and it comes up in a way of a spasmodic truth that is not connected, loses its power because of its presentation. And I don't think that people today put enough significance into the artistry of preaching. I think they're fascinated by the fact that they're up there without understanding that preaching is a calling and an art form. It is absolutely an art form. It is such an art form that a true master orator, in 2 minutes of listening at them, I can tell you right now, for 2 minutes, and I can tell you the depth of the preacher, because the artistry with which you paint this picture in front of an audience, it causes them to see the abstract idea that was born in your head or out of your prayer life or out of your consecration. It is then your responsibility to paint it until I see it without contamination or pollution or dilution. And I don't see as much of that today as I would like to. It's there, but it's not there in the quantities that I would like to see it left.
So, do you believe that great orators and preachers are born, or are they made?
That's a tough question. That's a tough question. Because when it comes to preaching, there is the God factor that I don't think can be produced by men. I think if you have all of the training and you don't have the calling, it will inevitably show. Conversely, if you have all of the calling and get none of the training, it will limit your reach.
Yeah.
So you don't want to become so engrossed with the fact that God called you that you don't prepare yourself to answer him. And so that preparation is respect for the one that called you.
It is.
And so I think they are both born from a God perspective. Before I formed thee in the earth, I knew thee, I ordained thee, and I sanctified thee. But they are also made because you take what was born and you wrap it around what is made, and then it is presented to the king.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Totally 100% agree with you, 1,000%. You call me with this title, Don't Drop the Mic. So the mic, the symbol of the mic, what does, because you call me with it. So you were feeling it deeply. So tell me about what's the importance of you've already said it, but just again, the mic.
Well, first of all, we are facing a very unique time in our lives. We are facing the changing of the guard. We're facing the transition of an era. We are, in many ways, passing the torch. We are seeing the next generation of orators be born. And when I say don't drop the mic, I'm saying don't lower the standard. Some of what I see happening today is a string of things that people got off of Instagram. And they get the phrase, but they don't get the place that it came from because they don't do the work and they don't do the research. They just say, ooh, that's good. I'm going to preach that next Sunday. Wait. Hold up a minute. You can't preach a tweet. You have to go back and dissect the text, and you have to do the work. You have to do the work. And I think in this instant age where everything is moving so quickly that we take shortcuts, but shortcuts will never lead to greatness.
Yeah.
Because you can't have the conviction that produced the statement if you extrapolate the statement and isolate it from the experience of digging out the truth that birthed the statement.
Right.
So you can say what I said, but it won't have the impact that it did because you're just repeating it. You have no depth. You're not familiar with the character. You don't understand the times. You have more information. When I speak, I have more information than I use. But that information creates a bed for what I use to lie in. And whether I use it or not, it gives me a confidence because I know my perspective because I have done the research around it to understand why this is important and what was going on in the time. And then most importantly, how is it applicable today? If you are scholarly enough to understand exactly the original intent of the text, but it is not relevant to the audience that you're speaking to, then I don't think that you can have the full power just stringing together statements that sound good because it's Saturday night and you're hard pressed for a sermon. I think today, a lot of our orators love crowds more than they love people, that they love the stage more than they love the word. For me, I'm allowing the audience to watch my relationship with the text. I'm not allowing the text to watch my relationship with the audience. And there's a distinct difference between the two. If everybody got up and walked out the room once I'm in my zone, it wouldn't make any difference. Because my statements are not predicated on the reaction of the crowd. I'm not relating to them, I'm relating to the text, and I'm letting you watch. That's what intimidated me about talking to you, because the intimacy with which I approach the text is so sacred, so intimate, that the most I could do would be to allow you to watch it. It is intimidating to explain it because out of the body of the things I prepared to say, I'm not a manuscript preacher, okay? So out of the body of the things I prepared to say, I have a frame, I have a structure, I have an order, I have an outline. Even if I don't use it on stage, I have it in my head. But the outline also has the elasticity to allow spontaneous combustion on the stage. Yeah. And what works in this room might not work in that room. Right. Having traveled all over the world, I have noticed that both the speaker and the listener brings the body of their experiences into the room. Yeah. And so when I go to Zimbabwe, or I go to London, the room responds differently to the same truth because they brought different experiences into that room. They hear differently. Right. And when you speak across cultures, what is a powerful point in this setting is not a powerful point in that setting because the body of their experiences don't create a bed for the text to lay in. Yeah. Yeah. And if you're going to be ambidextrous enough to preach in a lot of diverse settings, you have to be instinctive enough to sense the room and to understand the audience. It would be like me telling you to write a letter and not telling you who you're writing it to. Yeah. Who you're writing it to has a lot to do with how the letter is crafted and how you speak in different languages. I think that when we look at Acts 2 and we talk about each man heard him speak in his own language, we're not only talking about the majesty and the power of the day of Pentecost, we're also talking about that the propagation of the gospel is only occurs when each person in the room can hear you speak in their language. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that language is affected by race, by gender, by age, by intellectualism, by what's going on in my life at that moment. You don't want to use a carpenter's illustration in a baker's meeting. You know, so Jesus had this amazing ability. He was a storyteller, and the parables are Jesus telling stories. I think in the 21st century, Jesus would have made movies because he told stories that produced truth. Right. And those words were the paintbrushes, the words were the conduit for us to have an experience with truth that we would not have otherwise been able to do. And he does it in a language that the audience understands. He knows that they understand the complexities of the Good Samaritan. He understands how they feel about the Samaritans. He uses the very person that would be least likely in their era to be of assistance to them as a symbolism that God often uses people that your culture, your environment, your society would not embrace. Mm-hmm. And he is warning us not to limit our neighbors to a zip code. Yeah. Yeah. Because our neighbor may not always look like us and it may not always come in the form that we anticipated. But my point is that Jesus conveyed this truth, understanding how to get that truth to his audience, because he knew if he used a Samaritan that there is a backstory to the story. Mm-hmm. That never comes up in the story, but it explains why the Samaritan is used. Similarly, when you're in Ghana, there's a backstory. And you have to understand that words are fortified by the backstory that supports them. Yeah. And if you don't understand the people and the text, you won't be as effective as you ought to be at communicating in each man's language. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to shift a bit, and I want to ask you about if there is powerful preaching and powerful oratory, it comes out of a context, shaped in a specific culture. So what was the culture that shaped your preaching and your oratory?
Oh. I come from a lineage of storytellers as a person of African descent. I learned who my ancestors were through the passing down of stories in my family. So later, Henry Louis Gates would do a DNA test, but all it did was validate the tradition of stories that were passed down through my family. So I knew that my people were from Nigeria. my ancestors that got off the boat were from Nigeria. I knew that my ancestry embraced the perpetuation of an African perspective of storytelling and the appreciation for it. Before there were pens and pencils or pads or computers, there were stories by the fire. And I came from a generation that we didn't have a lot of money, so we had a lot of stories. I came from a generation where my mother would sit around and quote Paul Lawrence Dunbar and James Weldon Johnson and all of those sorts of things to us. She was graduated from Tuskegee, so she had a rich heritage of the African-American tradition. And so we couldn't afford to go to Broadway plays. We couldn't afford to go on vacations, so we would do talent shows, and we would sit around the house and we would just start telling stories, and my mother would quote poetry, and all of that. Because she was an educator, you are not an educator because you punched a clock. You can't punch out of being an educator. If you're an educator, it's just your point of view. I'm not a pastor because I have a congregation. I would be a pastor if there were no congregation. It's not a doing, it's a being, it's a point of view. And so all of those things help to inform the intimacy with which I speak. I speak to my congregation like I'm talking to my family. And like we're having an experience of intimacy, and I speak to them in the tradition of my ancestors. I speak to them from the perspective of being a father. So there's a gender dynamic to it. I see the text the way a father would see a text. I see the congregation from the way a father would. So you bring your gender, you bring your ethnicity, you bring your own story, your personal experiences, your childhood pains, what worked, what didn't work. All of that helps to create the weight to the way that you deliver the text. The text belongs to God, but the delivery is up to you.
Oh, in our conversations, I said to you that Zora Neale Hurston has something that she calls characteristics of Negro expression. You know, she was a folklorist, anthropologist. She, through the South, studied Black oratory. And she has an image that I think you just backed up, where in African culture, it's oral. In Western culture, it's text, or she called textual. And so she would say that in Western culture, you read a text. In African culture, it's like hieroglyphics. You describe the picture that you see, right? So it's like I'm reminded of what you know so very well, where you'll be preaching in the African American tradition, and they'll say, "Paint the picture, Doc. Paint the picture."
Yeah.
Well, what they're saying is the preacher sees the picture of what, and they're describing what, and that's very different than textual. Right? A textual description. So that orality that you're talking about, and she came up with some characteristics of Negro expression that I think that you exhibit. Mm-hmm. I think you bring forth masterfully. And so I want to, we've got a couple clips.
Okay.
So I want to show a clip, and then I want to, well, I guess I should describe the clip first, okay? So if Western culture does text and African culture does pictures like hieroglyphics, and we describe, one of the ways that we describe is through being a master of illustration, right? That it's easier to illustrate than it is to explain. So I can tell you what I see. I can illustrate it. That's easier. So we have a clip of you doing a masterful job of illustration. Okay. So we want to watch that clip, and then we'll get your comment.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
How are we doing so far?
We're just warming up, I hope. So you all see what I mean by to systematize. A person has it in their head.
Yeah.
Stand by, Jay. Here we go.
And so there was a game we would play called hide and go seek. And I grew up in West Virginia where we had big trees. You would go and somebody would stand over by the tree and put their face up against the tree and start counting. 1, 2, and they count. And while they counted, everybody would run and hide. And when they got to a certain number, they would turn around and start seeking that which was hidden. You might hide up under a rock, you might hide up under a bush, you might hide in the basement or behind a rock somewhere, a closed door, anywhere you could get covering because you didn't want to be discovered, you wanted to hide yourself. In our text today, it is almost as if God is playing hide and go seek with Adam. When the Bible talks about that they saw that they were naked, they hid themselves. They hid themselves. They saw that they were naked. They hid themselves. But when God got ready to talk, he didn't talk to they. He talked to the men. He talked to the man. He said, Adam, where are you? You must understand that the voice of the Lord walked through the cool of the garden. God broke his Sabbath day rest. It was broken by the weekend sins of mankind. The voice of the Father struck terror in the Son. It struck terror in the Son and made him go into hiding. And when he went into hiding, he hid himself from God. Without that happening, there's an ache in the heart of a man. A voice of leadership, a voice of discipline, a voice of authority is important in the life of even a young man. Somebody whose voice gets a different response.
Now, first we know that there was a Father's Day message.
Right.
That's the first thing. And the illustration of hide and go seek, that is an innate part of African American preaching and a part of your preaching. And so tell me what you think, I guess.
Well, I try to start away from, but in sync with where I'm going with the text. So to put the audience within the frame of an idea, I use this metaphorical introduction to emphasize hiding and seeking.
Right.
And I bring it down to something that almost every child can relate to.
Right.
And I'm appealing to the dynamics of the search.
Right.
Yeah, the search. yeah. And I'm using something so that the person who has no biblical background at all, who has come to my church, can still connect with the text through the vehicle of the metaphor, if not the text itself.
Right.
Had I went immediately into the text without the preface of setting the tone and the stage for the text to rest on, I would have appealed to the biblically literate, but I may have lost someone who's never been exposed to church before. And in a church of our magnitude, and considering our physical church and our streaming audience, I have a lot of people who are listening to me who have not heard that story. Mm-hmm. And so I have to approach the story with what you can relate to, much to explain what you could not relate to. Much like God uses things you can relate to explain things that you can't relate to. And so in the same similitude, I approach this text using something familiar. And then the other thing you have to remember, when you first get up to speak, people are settling into listening at you.
Yeah.
And so you don't put your substance up front.
Right.
because they're not really there yet.
Yeah.
There's a settling in the congregation where they've moved and they've gotten situated and they're listening at you and they're settling in, and you have to capture the fascination of the audience, or they're never really with you. Right. And you must understand the first few moments of the message, the audience is settling down. And then they're focusing on you, and then they gradually listen, you know, and the whole process crescendos between you and them. And so it's very unwise to get to your most substantive information in the early aspects of your message. I'm still building the frame. I haven't even started to paint the picture, you see. So the frame goes out first, and I develop the frame. And then once I set the mood and the tone, you know, everything else I'm going to say that day is in that introduction. Right. It is all about the fear and the running of children's feet to go hide in time. Right. Is parallel with the fear of I heard thy voice. Right. I was afraid, I was naked, and I hid myself. And then the onus of finding the searching God, the lost man, all of that. I'm setting the stage, you know. It's how an orator introduces what you can expect for the next few moments of my delivery.
So the point that I'm wanting to push from a technical standpoint as a pinch in the recipe for an audience is that you take something very simple as a container to ride divine truth into the hearts of people.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's the container. Now you're setting up the container so you can ride the truth. So somebody said it this way, is that when you do it well, you're deep and simple. When you do it bad, you're shallow and complex.
I like that. I like that.
So here's this hide and go seek.
You know, for me, I didn't start with hide and go seek. That's not where my message starts. My message starts with the text, but I back out of the message completely. Yeah. Take a panoramic view of what the message is to accomplish, and then create the narrative to introduce the subject. And for me, when you read the Bible, or you read any book, and you read it in black and white, the type is literally in black and white, the orator makes it in color. Yeah. So the color and the texture of the delivery is left up to the artistry of the person. But the thing that you cannot change is the literal meaning of the text, the black and white truth of the text. It is what it is. But the color gives you liberty. It gives you art form. I could approach the same text with a completely different introduction and come about it a completely different way, because that's all up to the way that you color in what matters about the text.
Right. Yeah. Let me go to another characteristic that Zora Neale Hurston says of the characteristics of Negro expression, preaching, rapping, whatever. She would say is the will to adorn. She argues that in the soul of the listener is a desire for beauty, and that the preacher must satisfy the desire for beauty. So in the African American preaching tradition, it has hyperbole, and so we have a clip, and we want to watch the clip, and after we watch this clip, then I'm going to...
Let me say one thing just before you go to the clip. So we have a family text line. We were texting last night. And my wife on the family text line says, I told them I was going to be talking to you today. And my wife says, what is black preaching? Mm-hmm. She says, is it the style of the preacher? Is it the race of the preacher? Is it the demographics of the congregation? And I said, what is great black preaching is very difficult to define, because it has different iterations of itself from generation to generation and from person to person. Yes. It's nebulous, it's abstract, it's unique, it's fresh every time. It is neither Gardner Taylor nor C.L. Franklin, it is both. Right. Okay, so there's a wide range of what I think could be considered great preaching, whether it's black preaching or not. And then we went deeper. She said, so what distinguishes black preaching if it's not the style and it's not the ethnicity of the person and it's not the complexity of the crowd? I said, it is not the style or the complexity of the crowd. It is, in fact, the place that the preaching comes from. It is not how it is said, it is where it comes from. It comes from the soul. It comes from the struggle. It comes from the strife of life, and it comes from an ability to take. What is unique about us is that we have mastered the art of turning pain into power, of being able to get our heart to come out of our mouth and to make sense out of the nonsensical history we have endured, and to demystify it in such a way that it makes sense in that creative moment. It is until you have had a soul that has groaned in the night, you will never master the art of preaching, because preaching takes that groaning and that moaning and that disorientation and that doubt and that fear, and it takes the nonsensical issues of life and lays it out in some sort of order of structure that says that you find vindication in the message. And you can't find vindication in the message if you haven't been accused in the world. You understand what I'm saying? So I said, well, if you seek to be a great preacher, it's not about whether you hoop or not. It's not about whether you teach or not. It's not about whether you're loud or not. It's not any of those things. Yes. It is the soul. Yes. It is the guts and the tissue and the fiber of your story, and bringing it up out of your mouth and making it become gasoline. The gasoline, when it's properly used, you shouldn't smell it, but you can feel the impact of it in the roaring of the engine. So I don't want you to smell gas. I don't want you to feel pain when I'm preaching. I want to take that pain and combust it into that message in such a way that it becomes the engine that drives the intensity and the urgency. And we as a people have given that as a gift to the world. Not to say that white people or brown people or any other people couldn't do it, but it is our gift to you. And then you can take it and emulate it if you have some pain. If you have enough pain, if you've cried long enough, if you've suffered long enough, if you've done without long enough. Black preaching is not about style or hooping or changing keys. It is about being able to oh, I get excited. You should have got it. It is the art of turning ashes into beauty. It is the art of preaching with stripes on your back. It is the art of getting a message out of raising your children alone. It is being abandoned. It is being divorced. It is being raped. It's being ostracized, and still I rise. And still I rise. See, you cannot say and still I rise if you haven't faced opposition. And we had to learn how to turn our ashes into beauty, our mourning into joy. We had no choice. Exactly. That was all we had. Right. And so all of that comes into the text, whether it's a woman or a man, or whether you're a liberal or conservative, that's irrelevant. If you haven't been broken, if you haven't been shattered, if you haven't been able to be broken and be shattered and turn that into something that is usable to catapult you forward, that is black preaching. That is black preaching. Now let's play the clip.
Not yet. We're not going to the clip yet. I want to add a few footnotes
come on.
to what you just said. I just want to put it the way that I think it's correct. It's very hard to define black preaching. I did several conferences where I brought 25 pastors together. I brought 25 homileticians together, and I said, what is black preaching? And we couldn't define it. Now, we know what it is when we hear it, right? But we couldn't define it. So what I concluded from that is exactly what you said, is it is a tradition that comes from the oral traditions of Africa, mixed with the African-American experience of slavery, oppression, racism, Jim Crow, poverty, shootings of young, all of this stuff. This thing arises called black preaching that has as its essence hope. And I also realize, I'm going to go back to your comment about Dr. King. As fabulous and as wonderful as an orator, I did my dissertation on the oratory of Dr. Martin Luther King, my PhD dissertation. I realized that no preacher is greater than the tradition that they come from. Because the tradition passes on stuff, right? It's like the creating out of the theological argument. Did God create ex nihilo out of nothing, or was there substance? Well, all of us who claim this African American preaching tradition have been given this substance, this hopeful, this orality, this master of illustration, this ability to see, storytelling, all of these things. And each generation has to add to the tradition.
Right.
Right. So C.L. Franklin added to the tradition, or Prathia Hall, or Gardner Taylor adds to the tradition. And so let me give an example, and I'll stop, because you excite me to, I'm supposed to be a reasoned academic. When this stuff comes to you, as exactly what you said, you have to live it. So, for example, C.L. Franklin. Let me go back. That's C.L. Franklin. There is, his most famous sermon is "The Eagle Stirreth the Nest." In 1889, the story of the eagle stirring the nest is floating. Stirring the nest is floating in the black church preaching tradition. Preachers are preaching, not the same sermon, but the sermon, right? So C.L. Franklin got this sermon through the tradition. Now, what he does with it is genius, right? And not many people can do what he did with it, which is his contribution to it. But neither can you deny the substance that's been passed on and the genius that takes the substance and works it into a presentation that C.L. Franklin, and I argue, before the advent of internet, and your ability to beam yourself across the world, was probably the most imitated preacher in the history of black people, right?
Okay.
So even though we're imitating, it's our job to take the substance, and which is what you've done, take the substance of the tradition that's been passed to you, add your flow, your rhythm, your cadence, your genius, your creativity to it. So I think what I want always, to say, it is the genius you add, but it's also the tradition from which you cometh.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, you got me started. One more thing. We have to go. When you look at the narrative of the gospel message, and you look at the history of a suffering people, and to be redeemed by a suffering Savior.
Yes.
When you look at a people who have literally been beaten, and you look at a God who has been laid on a whipping post.
Yes.
When you look at a people who have been unjustly arrested.
Yes.
And you look at a Jesus that they found no fault in and yet crucified.
Yes.
He is kin to my history.
Exactly.
You see, so he fits well at the family table.
Yes.
You see, this notion of a suffering Savior.
Yes.
Fits well with a suffering people of any group of people, a suffering woman, a suffering gender, a suffering generation. The suffering Savior reflects us in such a way that we can be kin to him, though he's 2,000 years away from me. We are kin to the story. We are kin to the story. And to hear that he is hidden and then risen gives me hope that it may be Friday. Yeah, it may be Friday, but if I can withstand the turbulence of Friday, that Sunday's coming. You see, and so how we approach our faith, we meet at the cross. with our own pain. When I was in South Africa, I told them that we came through slavery and you came through the apartheid, and I'll meet you at the cross. You see, so your history is different than mine. Right. Your pain is different than mine. But in the cross, we find a commonality of situation that we can be redeemed because he has proven to be kin to me, not by his skin to me, but his story is dear to me because it is a reflection of me. Right. You see, you see what I'm saying? So I'm already at an advantage. Right. Because his stripes are not strange to me. His stripes are not strange to me. His injustice is not strange to me. The fact that he could be arrested wrongfully is not strange to me. The fact that the trial could be adjudicated and he could be executed and be innocent is not strange to me. The fact that he would rise again is not strange to me, because every day I have to have a resurrection. Yes, yes. Because every night before it, I've had a crucifixion. And so this whole thing that weeping may endure for a night, joy cometh in the morning, all the whole story, the 400 years of Israel being enslaved and then breaking free and wandering. I've been in my wilderness. I've been a slave. I've been broken. All of that is synergistically companionable to my own identity. So I identify with the Christ story. I identify with the Bible story. I find my face in its pages. Yes. And so when I look into the text, I see me. I see me. I see me. And then you got me started. We're not going to be able to do this. When all of that collides together, it doesn't collide on the stage, it collides in my study. Yes. It collides in my study, it collides in my study. And then the challenge is to get what combusted in my study to then explode on my stage. If it doesn't combust in your study, it won't explode on your stage. You can't just love the text when you get in front of people. Right. You have to come into the text ready to detonate because it exploded in your house. Yeah. You know, I'm gonna stop. You get me fired up now.
I just want to, I'm trying to hold myself. I just want to add a footnote to what you just said. You remember I sent you Gardner Calvin Taylor's His Own Clothes.
Yes.
This is a sermon about where Dr. Taylor describes the suffering of Jesus being beaten and whipped. Exactly what you just said, beaten and whipped. And some of my analysis is that he starts with the African-American tradition of the big lips and the darky and all of that, those negative stereotypes, how we were ridiculed, and he says, in essence, ushered out of the human family, and then he switches to Jesus. And talks about Jesus being beaten and whipped and almost ushered out of the human family. And where I'm going is we identify with the suffering, and then, the text is, of course, he crucified in his own clothes. No, the first part, they stripped him out of his clothes and they put him back in his own clothes, and that he's coming back in his own clothes. We're talking about the second coming. But when Jesus rides to victory, we ride to victory.
Right.
We're so identified. That's my main point. I messed that up.
No, I got you.
But our main point is the identification is so created, so deeply and profoundly. He was beaten, we were beaten. He had trumped up charges, we got trumped up charges. He had a kangaroo court. Sometimes we get a kangaroo court, right? So when he rides, he comes up out of that grave, we come out of that grave, and we ride to victory, and we have hope. And that's the genius of African-American preaching. That was just a little footnote.
No. I think that what we're talking about, when you start talking about substitution and themes like substitution and identification, when you start talking about baptism, the whole purpose of baptism is to identify with the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord. Right. And that identification for us is in our own story. It's in the story of our ancestry, but it is also in our own personal story. Yes. And I suspect that it is in the story of all people.
I agree with you, 100%.
I don't think that you can live in this world, no matter your color, and not have some synergism with crucifixion.
Yes.
What makes us unique is that we have hung out there so long You know, we have hung so long from the cross that we have become masterful at getting beauty out of agony.
Yes.
Okay. In the absence of generational wealth, in the absence of strategic cultural advantage, in the absence of the things of this world, we have instead been awarded with a glory that is unique to anybody that has been denied.
Yes.
Okay, so I think wherever I have ever been, where there were people of color, there was always great churches. From the deepest parts of Africa, where there is no running water and they have no building, with fabric flapping in the wind, up under sticks. Thousands and thousands, sometimes 1 million people will be gathered together to worship God in some way or form or other. And whether you go to the Caribbean or you go to the Aborigines or whether you go throughout America or whether you go to East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, it doesn't matter. There's something that we have mastered about church because it has helped to anesthetize our pain. And it has become the substratum of the fact that we are not forgotten, that redemption is nigh, that we can escape, that we can endure, that we can go forward. And in some way or another, like Noah, who preached the same message for 120 years, in some way or another, every Sunday we preach the same message. The title changes, the scripture changes, but the story is still the same. You know, and woe be unto us if we find another story. Because this is my story. This is my song. You know, praising my Savior all the day long. There is nothing else to preach. 120 years, Noah says the same thing. And every Sunday morning you find a different way to say the same thing. And everybody hears it based on where they are at the time that you spoke it. And people often ask me, what is the best message you ever heard? And I said, the one I needed the most at the time I heard it. You know, because what makes a message great is when it's relevant. And if you cannot relate to the audience, I've seen great preachers get thrown by the crowd. I've seen great preachers, maybe a black person in front of an all-white crowd or a white preacher in front of an all-black crowd can easily be thrown by the crowd because you let what's different about us blind you from what's alike about us. There's actually more to unite us than there is to divide us. And you could be much more broad with your ministry if you don't walk up on the stage blinded by the glare of what's different about the audience and find something that's common amongst us. That common thing of all men is the bridge that I walk across when I'm in Australia. So I'm not an Australian, but and I don't speak with the dialect of the Australian people, but the bridge that I walk across is that they are people. There are people like me. When I'm out in Africa, in the rural parts of Africa, preaching with the translator to a person who's never lived in a house with electricity, somewhere in the rural parts, because in the cities, their cities are like our cities, but in the rural areas, you run into that. I don't let what's different about us stop me from connecting with you. I let what's common about us, hope, affirmation, love of family, questions about self, the uncertainty of youth, trying to figure out who am I and where do I fit, the grappling with the changes of age. Nobody escapes that. Nobody, and so if you're going to be an orator that can speak outside of your tribe, you have to find the common threads that are common to all men and tie them into the common threads that are in Scripture, and thereby you unite us rather than divide us.
I'm going to say this last piece, and then we're going to try to get to this clip and go on to the next section. Is that, what you're saying and what I think I'm saying is that we're not saying that African-American preaching or preachers are better than anybody. Over in a corner, so we preach better than anybody else in the whole world. What we're saying is that God has given gifts by virtue of our experience that we offer to the entire human family. So Du Bois said, this is the gift of black folk to the new world. You know, that black people bring gifts to the new world, and of the free spirit, of the ministering hand, of joy and music is what he offered as a gift. And one of the gifts that we give is this gift of preaching. And I think that we, by virtue of our experience, we got there sooner. But it is human, and it is universal, and it is on every continent, in every place, because all of us suffer. And as a matter of fact, all of us suffer deeply, by the way.
Right.
You know, the particular form of the depth of the, you know, of the pain might look different, but all of us. And I think that's also part of why your preaching is reaching so many people on so many different continents, because you understand that, and that there's something universal about human experience.
I just came from a cruise, and I was hosting the cruise. We had about 2,000 people on the boat, and I always like to go out in a reasonable amount of crowd. When it's real big, I don't try to do it, but in a reasonable crowd, to see when I called who answered. Thereby, I measure who was affected enough to respond. And it was just utterly amazing. From the very aged to very young. There were ladies there from New Zealand who flew to America to get on a boat with me to sail the Caribbean. Quite a few from New Zealand, quite a few from Australia, quite a few from London, quite a few from Nigeria, quite a few from Accra in Ghana. And then out of the American order, there were intellects and professors, there were business people and elderly people, there were grandmas in wheelchairs and people who were coming up on the boat with walkers. Okay, who said, I've been following you since you were in West Virginia. I was on every cruise you ever had. I've been waiting on you to have your next cruise. You're measuring impact by response. Right. Okay, so you make out a cry, and then to me, effort means nothing without impact. So I know the effort has gone out there, but when I walked the floor and shook hands and met the people, I measured impact. Well, who are you? Where did you come from? What did you hear? I'm an E member. I follow you on the E Church, and I decided I was going on the cruise. And everybody had a story that brought them there. Everybody had a story that brought them there. And on the boat, we became family. I sat down with this one lady, I think she was from Germany, and she was sitting at the table by herself, and I came over where she was and said, "You're sitting by yourself, and I won't have that." And I came and sat down with her and started talking to her for a little bit, and it just tickled her to death. Just that I came and sat down and talked to her. We are not just living together, we are dying together. And when you get old enough to understand that we're not just living, that we are in fact dying together, and that you get to choose as you are dying who you are dying with. You know, and I came to this church a young man, 38 years old. I wasn't even 40 yet, and now I'm 62, and I've watched my audience marry, give birth. I've watched those kids graduate from college. I've watched hair turn gray. I've watched joints swell up. I've watched us all dying together while we were living together. And as we die on the cross of life together, we seek some myrrh, some vinegar, some anesthesia that helps us to confront the fact that today she buries her mother, and tomorrow I bury my father, and last week he buried his child, and we choose to congregate together because there's strength in numbers, like different animals, that penguins come together in the North Pole. They find warmth in their ability to survive the cold by huddling together. And for me, the church is a huddling place where the winds can't break into our ranks because we connect together and we laugh together and we cry together. When you understand the church to be that, then you feed that, you protect that, you revive that, you defend that. Because if you destroy that, where will we gather? Where will we gather? If we lose that and we face the wind, each one alone, then what do we have? And so the preservation of the whole notion of the church is built on the strength of the preacher to see the bigger point, so that you cannot be a great preacher and be petty. Yes. Because you get stuck in the minutia of little things that little-minded people let stop them from bigger ideas. You have to be broad enough in your thinking that you're sitting there as a shepherd to keep the flock together. And as much as you can, you don't let the small things stop you from doing that. And preaching is I'm probably getting too comfortable now. But sometimes when I'm standing on the stage, I feel like Captain Kirk, in Star Trek, because from that point, from that post, from that position, there's all of these people out there, and I'm trying to get us to land safely. You understand? To sit down in that captain's chair or man the pulpit is a huge responsibility. I mean, just a massive responsibility. And whoever heralds that pulpit has to be able to compartmentalize what was going on in your life and set that aside for the betterment of the whole. You have to be able to step over who hurt your feelings and who didn't like you and who left your church, and not be petty enough to dilute the milk of the word down to the water of your own ego, your egocentric ideologies, and to rise above all of that and preach when you're wounded, and preach when you're happy, and preach when you're sad, and not allow that to be a deterrent where you are jerking the congregation around based on what kind of day you had. You see, so there's a discipline to it, and there's a commitment to it. I'm gonna stop there. We'll never play the clip.
Yeah, we're gonna hold the clip one more time. I think deep and simple versus shallow and complex reaches all kinds of people. I think the testimony in the boat is about being deep and simple. You're tremendously deep, but tremendously simple. The second piece I want to add to that is, something that I said to you. Many people, I don't know how many, but there is the celebrity Bishop T.D. Jakes. And then there's the pastor who on Sunday morning is trying to feed the flock, and Monday through. And people don't often get to see, which is why part of why I was so excited about doing the interview, because as I was a pastor, am a pastor, I know a pastor's heart, and it starts with feeding the flock, caring for the flock, just trying to minister to people. Now, what God does with that is truly amazing in these kind of places and spaces that you're operating in, global, every continent, But what people miss, if you get wrapped into the celebrity Bishop T.D. Jakes and miss the Sunday morning pastor, who probably, when he had 12 members, pastored as hard or harder
Absolutely.
than now. Absolutely. And so there's a sense in which people look at the broadcasts, the places, the people you meet, the places you go, all of that celebrity stuff that is important and is okay, but that's not at the heart of this thing. So I think I got that.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely, if you played my old tapes in the storefront, there's no difference in the intensity where there was no camera. The person who was holding the camera was shouting. This whole notion of celebrity is a side effect of effectiveness. Every drug you take has side effects. And if you're effective at anything long enough and deep enough and wide enough, you're going to run into the side effects of how people perceive you. And it doesn't matter if people see you as a celebrity as long as you don't see yourself as one. You know, when you were small in your own eyes, God blessed you. And I think that you can easily lose your equilibrium by reading your own press. And your press fluctuates from person to person. Years and years ago, I was walking down the street with another well-known preacher, and somebody said, "Oh my God, these men are men of God. I was in prison and I heard them preaching and they blessed my life." And he was just ready, just Hosanna, you know. And we kept on walking. Went on down the street, and there was a street preacher, woman preaching on the corner, and she preached, "I see you big time preachers over there, you devils in your big churches." And I thought to myself, in the space of one block, I went from being an angel to being a devil. And to both of them, I kept on walking. If you can keep on walking, regardless to how people define you, you can really get something done. Because I never in my wildest dreams thought I would end up here. And had I known it, I would have run harder the other way. That was a side effect. And you learn to live with the side effects of people, of how people describe you and how they see you. What your anointing, though, is predicated upon how you see yourself. Right. Your anointing doesn't flow to the whims of how people describe you. Your anointing comes when you can keep your feet on the ground and keep your head on straight. And people ask me sometimes, who really get to know me, they said, "You're so humble. I can't believe you're so down to earth." And I think that's really funny, because I don't know whether I'm humble or not. But they ask me, "How do I do that?" I said, "Because I know me." See, you have an idea of me. I don't have any trouble keeping my feet on the ground, because I know me. You know how little kids that hear you preach and say, "There goes Jesus." I know I'm not Jesus. I'm very clear on that. Okay, so when you have not lost recognition that the master is working with dirt, then whatever you become, it's only because he graced you to become it. Because you never lose sight of the fact that you were dirt when he found you. And he put you up on a wheel and started working on you and made you appear different things to different people based on the light they see you in. But this whole notion of celebrity status, celebrities are lost too. And they need Christ too. One of the things about Christianity that is disturbing to me is that it is only marketed to the poor. As if I am successful or educated, I don't need redemption. And yet, if it were properly applied, Jesus ministered to all types of people, the upper echelon as well as the downtrodden, with the same effectiveness. He calls the tax collector down out of the tree. He does the same type of work with him that he does the woman caught in the act of adultery. He deals with everybody because he recognizes it is not status or stuff or cameras that is the impetus that inspired me to minister. You have to realize, sir, I came from West Virginia. I had never seen a mega church. I didn't know to want it because I had never seen it. Hardly any big preachers came to Charleston. So this whole dazzling, glimmering, shimmering side effect was not why I took the pill. I've learned to live with it. I've learned to understand it. I've learned how to protect myself in it. But it was never my attraction to it. It still isn't to this day. I like ordinary things and ordinary people. I describe myself as a person who likes to pick out his own chicken wings. It is that about me, I believe, that causes ordinary people to be drawn to me. Yeah. That I can walk in and out of Hollywood and then go into a homeless shelter and find the same synergism that I know how to abase and abound. And I think the broader you build yourself, where you don't get caught up in the headlines of you angels, you great men of God, you're a wonderful person, and then somebody, you're a devil. You can't read either headline. You have to keep on walking and not lose your pace. Though you are criticized one day and exalted the next day, that can't be the wine you drink. Because if you do, it will intoxicate you. And once you are intoxicated, your power is gone. Your power is gone. And I think that God gives notoriety to people who don't need it. Because the people who really need it and want it the most, I notice they never get it because their motives are not right. I never wanted, I still don't like that. I just endure that, and I've learned to live with that, and I have decided that I was strong enough inside to withstand whatever you think. And that inner strength has to adorn you so that you can preach strength to struggling people. If you don't go through that decision to withstand opposing ideas inside, it's not important to me that I argue with you outside. It's important to me that I don't let the waves of your opinion wet the deck of my ship. So as long as I can keep it out there and not let it get in, and I use a lot of different modalities to do that. Sometimes it's not reading it. Sometimes it's not responding to it. Sometimes it is responding to it because I have a right to have a voice too. It depends on what it is, what I do and do not respond to. But that was never the thing that drew me. And so what you describe about celebrity status is a picture, and what I'm talking about is an ultrasound. So from the outside, if you're seen with certain people, they then say you're a celebrity pastor. That's a picture, that's a photo. But if you did an ultrasound, I'm looking at that person and I think that's a person. Puffy is a person. Kanye is a person. You know what I'm talking about? Denzel Washington is a person. Will Smith is a person. He's not the character you saw on TV. That's somebody's child. That was somebody's baby. And if you see souls as souls, because if you don't see them like that, you won't be able to minister to them, and you're building an identity around something that's fickle. Success is fickle. People can say Hosanna today. I can remember when people revered Bill Cosby. He's in jail today. Things can turn on a dime. And so if you build yourself on how people perceive you, you have built your castle on sand. But if you build yourself on how God sees you, that's going to remain the same, because there's nothing about us that surprises God. There's nothing past, present, or future about us that surprises God. So I try to keep my feet pretty flat on the floor, and I try what they see as celebrity status, I see as stress and responsibility. To him whom much is given, much is required. So you're talking about what's given, and I can't see what's given for paying what's required. That's true. And all of that, for me, when it comes to my preaching, as my worldview has changed, and I have got to see the penthouse suite, and I've gotten to sit with presidents and kings, it grew me as a preacher. A little quick example. I used to hear preachers say, God is going to bless you until all of your bills are going to be deleted out the computer, and he's going to do something supernatural. And I thought that's a great perspective if you're the person who owes some money. But if you're the person to whom the money is owed, what you just shouted about is your blessing but my curse. But the preacher who was preaching didn't think from the other side of it, because he is the ower and not the owee. I've been both. you'd be surprised how that changes how you see justice. Because to the person that you owe, deleting the debt is not justice, because it's a legitimate debt. To the person who owes the debt, your description of justice is a curse to the person who's owed it, because if the people who owe you don't pay you, you can't go forward either. So my point is this. Your discernment of the text is a reflection of the position. What in television, it's POV, it's your point of view. We got 3 cameras in this shoot. Each one of them is given a different point of view. None of them are lying. One camera's on me, one camera's on you, one camera's on both of us. All of them are showing different perspectives of the same incident. When you preach, if you take a camera and aim it at all the different characters, you get a different view of the story. If you take one camera and put it on the elder brother, and take another camera and put it on the younger brother, and take another camera and put it on the father, now you've got a view of everything. Okay, so when we start talking about what informs our preaching is the amount of cameras in the shoot. Yeah. And your cameras grow as your life's experience grows. Yes. And what I have been blessed with is a panoramic view. I am living my father's dreams and my mother's nightmares. I am living where my father could never imagine me going, and my mother died telling me, be careful, baby. Don't let him kill you. So my mother's nightmares that's my baby on the cross. You know, and I've gone as far as I can go with you. Mama can't go any further. And don't let him kill you. And yet my father would be saying, that's my son up there. Look at that boy. I can't believe Tommy did that. And both of them are telling the truth. It is as gratifying as it is horrifying. And you have to live within the tension of both polarities without succumbing to either horror or gratification. You have to be leveled in the middle, or you won't be able to do this on the scale you need to do it on. I don't know what to do.
Can I ask you to follow up on that? Can I ask you? So, how do you see yourself?
Oh, that's complicated. Oh, that's complicated. My wife and I joke and tease because I was born in June, and you know, the astrology would say I'm a Gemini, and I always tell her it's 2 of us. She said, no, it's 10. She said, it's at least 10 of y'all up in there. That's scary, isn't it? Which one is talking now? I see myself most easily in my simplicity. I think I was 50 before I could look at my notoriety. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't look at it because I couldn't look at it like a window washer can't look down. If I allowed myself to see where I was, it would scare me to death. At that height, I would be paralyzed, and I couldn't look at it till I was about 50. A willful blindness stopped me from seeing it, because I would have stopped my job because of my height. So I looked at the window and I didn't look at how far I was from the ground. And it took me being around 50 to get the courage to look at the sum total of who I am. And even now I sip it real slow. I don't let it go to my head, not in the sense of arrogance, but the height of it is horrifying. The weight of it, the responsibility of it makes my life so small. Notoriety makes your life so small that you crave simple things. Like my brother had opened up the door of his garage and had a couple of friends over, and they were playing music in the garage and eating barbecue. And just the freedom to do simple things like that, to go through. I have never been to the state fair because I could never go to the fair and not be bombarded. So what people call success makes your life small because you lose normalcy. The loss of normalcy is a poverty that I can't even describe. Just ordinary, average, simple things have to be, sometimes you have to pay twice as much for a hamburger just so that the people in the room will leave you alone to eat it. So you end up paying $20 for a Whataburger, you know, or $50 to get a Whataburger, basically, that you could have drove by and got for half as much. But if you went in Whataburger and ate it, you couldn't eat it in peace. So what you're paying for is not the burger, you're paying for the peace. So things, when you see people, no matter what their profession is, that are well known, I immediately inherit whatever you read or whatever you thought about me without ever even getting to know me. Yeah. And so to avoid all of that, it took me being 50 before I had the courage to look at it. I denied it till I was 50. That's how, it's not, I'm just ordinary, because denying it was my way of coping with it. At 50, I was courageous enough to say it is what it is. And life begins when you accept the side effect. So what looks glamorous is, it took me a while to not see it as crucifixion with a different kind of nail. It's just a different kind of nail. Yeah. You know, I was crucified, impoverished church, 7 members in it. That was one kind of nail. Now 30,000 members. It's just a different kind of nail, but it still crucifies your flesh. God lets no one escape their cross. The nails change and the wood changes, but the crucifixion in spirit is the criteria for being a disciple. And nobody, rich or poor, well-known or obscure, gets away without a cross. Yeah. And so when I call it a side effect, that's because that's what it is. That wasn't the shiny thing that drew me. And if anybody who thinks that has to ignore the first 20 years of my preaching to get to the glamour of camera lights. So if it was the lights that did it, explain the first 20 years. Preaching on welfare, preaching with my lights off and my water off, pastoring a church and didn't have gas to get to the church I was pastoring. Explain those 20 years. I see myself from there, and that's my strength to survive here. My strength is in my story and my struggle and my agony. My strength is in the fact that I dug ditches till my hands were bleeding to buy diapers for my boys. And I remind the devil when I'm in a fight with him that I'm that guy. I'm that guy with bloody hands and a full heart, and preach faith with no lights on. And preach that God would bless his people, even though I had to thumb to get to the Bible class. I'm that guy. Tenacious and relentless. That adornment has nothing to do with money or people or degrees. That has something to do with the stuff that your parents put in you. Every day I could go to my mother and father's grave and kiss their headstones for how they taught us to be self-reliant and gave us the inner strength to withstand public opinion and worldview. If they had not raised me the way they raised me, my life would have crushed me. I am so grateful. I am so grateful for how they raised me. I would have never been able to withstand this without that. My mother was tough, and she didn't allow you to fall apart. And if you fell apart, she'd slap you and say, "Get yourself together." I mean, she was tough. I mean, there was no room for losing it. And in the storm, I can see why he gave me that kind of mother and that kind of father so that I could withstand. Because when you are leading people who are wounded, they often attack the person who is leading them. And you have to be a strong enough lifeguard to jump into the pool to save somebody who's kicking you while you're trying to pull them out. And if you're not willing to be kicked, don't be a lifeguard, because in their panic to get up, we often see our saviors as assailants. And we think that their success is at our expense. And so success, however you define it, breeds contempt. But all of that, everything, the lights off, the raggedy 1967 Valiant that I drove up the road till it fell apart and had to thumb, all of that, to speaking at the White House and the National Cathedral, all of that to speaking to millions of people in Africa, all of that comes to the text. All of that crescendos in the text, all of that gives you the breath to go in and out of audiences. See, your education came through a university. Mine was, the world was my school. So I stuck my fingers in the bullet holes of Winnie Mandela's headboard on her bed and understood her pain by the feel of my fingers in those bullet holes. I went down and stuck my fingernails in the scratchings where the slaves waited in Elmina for the slave ships to come, and connected that way. And so I got to do it and see it. And if you never put away your pencil and never stop being a student, you'll never stop learning all of your life. And don't lock yourself into the idea that the classroom ends at the door. Because every encounter, good or bad, right or wrong, mistakes made, business, life, relationships, all of it is coming to educate you in some way. You never graduate from God's university. You never graduate. If you are smart enough to perceive every new person that comes into your life came to teach you something. Every person who broke your heart came to teach you something. And if you take the class and get the lesson rather than the bitterness, you become wiser every day.